The Natufian, Afro-Asiatic, Proto-Semitic genome. Our goal is to establish the genome of early Proto-Semitic populations. In order to do this, we must first understand who are the ancestors of Proto-Semites. We will use the four fields of anthropology to come to our conclusions. Four fields or four subfields of anthropology: physical anthropology, archaeology, linguistic anthropology, and cultural anthropology. Cultural anthropology: the study of cultures and societies of human beings and their very recent past. Traditional cultural anthropologists study living cultures and present their observations in an ethnography. Archaeology. Archaeology, the study of past societies and their cultures, especially the material remains of the past, such as tools, food remains, and places where people lived. Linguistic anthropology. Linguistic anthropology, the study of language, especially how language is structured, evolution of language, and the social and cultural context for language. Physical anthropology. Physical anthropology, also called biological anthropology. Physical anthropology is the study of human evolution and variation, both past and current. These are the four fields of anthropology that we will be using. So using the four fields of anthropology, we are going to understand 1. The culture of Proto-Semites and their ancestors. 2. The language family of Proto-Semites and the originators of it. 3. The archaeology for the location, time period, and origin of Proto-Semites and their ancestors. And 4. The Y-DNA haplogroup and genetic data of the ancestors of Proto-Semites and related populations. All of this will lead us to the conclusions of the early Proto-Semitic genome. This genome would also likely best represent the biblical Shem. We already have some of our questions answered. We know that Semites are an Afro-Asiatic or Afro-San people. Semite, member of a people speaking any of a group of related languages, presumably derived from a common language, Semitic. This is from Britannica. Britannica as well, dealing with Semitic languages. Semitic languages, languages that form a branch of the Afro-Asiatic language phylum. Members of the Semitic group are spread throughout North Africa and Southwest Asia and have played preeminent roles in the linguistic and cultural landscape of the Middle East for more than 4,000 years. Afro-San. Afro-San, a large family of related languages spoken both in Asia and Africa. Semitic, a major branch of the Afro-Asiatic language family. The ancient Hebrews of Israel are an Afro-Asiatic, Afro-San Semitic people. Hebrew, a member of an ancient Semitic people claiming descent from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, an Israelite. Hebrew, a member of any of a group of Semitic peoples who inhabited ancient Palestine and claimed descent from the biblical patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And here is the territory of Palestine or Israel or Canaan land. This is the land that King David and King Solomon ruled, and this is the promised land given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is basically within the Levant. Israel, Palestine, and Syria and the Jordan, as well as Lebanon. The ancestors of Afro-Asiatic Afro-Sans are the Natufians. Given the modern distribution of Semitic languages over the area in question, which belong to the larger Afro-Asiatic family, it seems appropriate to suggest that these first farmers of the Levant and their Mesolithic predecessors, including the Natufian culture, were speaking a Proto-Afro-Asiatic language. And again, Semites, Hebrews, they are part of that Proto-Afro-Asiatic stock. It may be that Proto-Semitic continued to develop within the Levant and Syria area, since both Abelite and Akkadian early Semitic languages are there attested early, the former around 2400 BC. And this is from Cambridge. And we see that the Natufians, ancestors of Proto-Afro-Asiatic languages, or rather that they are the first people who spoke Proto-Afro-Asiatic languages, and they resided in the Levant, and they were the first farmers. And Proto-Semites would come from them. And again, this is from Cambridge. In Hot Pursuit of Language in Prehistory reads, this paper makes an additional inference, since there is archaeological and physical anthropological reason to believe that the Natufians were related to modern Semitic-speaking peoples of the Levant. So the Natufians, from an archaeological and an anthropological perspective, are the ancestors of Semites. Here is the area of Natufian culture, and it is in the Levant, stretching from Sinai all the way up into modern-day Syria. The Y DNA haplogroup of Proto-Afro-Asiatics / Natufians is haplogroup E. The Proto-Afro-Asiatic group carrying the E-P2 mutation may have appeared at this point in time and subsequently gave rise to the different major population groups, including current speakers of the Afro-Asiatic languages and pastoralist populations. So we see a connection with Afro-Asiatic languages, haplogroup E, and pastoralist populations. This is from Y chromosome E haplogroups, their distribution and implication to the origin of Afro-Asiatic languages and pastoralism. Such a scenario would also explain the presence of Y chromosome haplogroup E in the Natufians and Levantine farmers, a common link between the Levant and Africa. So yet again, we see that Natufians are linked to haplogroup E, and that Levantine farmers are also linked to haplogroup E. This is from Paleolithic DNA from the Caucasus revealed core of West Eurasian ancestry. Culturally, Natufians / Proto-Afro-Sans were the first pastoralists and agriculturalists. This is from the book The Winds of Change, and it reads, the Natufians were a Neolithic culture that extended from modern-day Israel to southeastern Turkey, and around 11,500 years ago, they were among the first peoples to start cultivating grains and domesticating cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs in this landscape, which varied from Mediterranean woodland and scrubland and steppe. So this is interesting. So Natufians, they were the first to cultivate grain. They were the first to domesticate cattle, sheep, and goats and other animals, and they resided in the Levant. The Natufian culture in the Levant, threshold of the origins of agriculture, and it reads, data has led to the recognition that a Natufian homeland existed in the central Levant, and that the Natufians were secondary foragers and perhaps the earliest farmers. This information led to the recognition that the Natufian culture played a major role in the emergence of the early Neolithic farming communities, or what is known as the agricultural revolution. So again, just to sum that up, the Levant is the homeland of the Natufians, and they are some of the first, the earliest farmers, and they are part of that Neolithic farming, also known as the agricultural revolution. So they are very important when it comes to the origins of agriculture, the Natufian culture in the Levant. And so this is the prehistory of a dispersal, the Proto-Afro-San, Proto-Afro-Asiatic farming lexicon. And this is very important because this is how we know that the Natufians were some of the earliest Afro-Asiatic people based on the farming lexicon. And this is from Alexander Metlorev. And it reads, the identification of Proto-Afro-Sans as Natufians and post-Natufians seems to satisfy all the four criteria. Besides the farming lexicon, there are sets of reconstructed Proto-Afrosan terms pointing to incipient animal breeding, a wide variety of dwelling and settlement types, a territory characterized by both desert and steep forest type of terrain and drying riverbeds, as well as deep permanent streams, a vegetation typical of such terrain, and the animals whose bones have been found at the Natufian and early Neolithic post-Natufian sites. Interestingly, there is a large number of common Afrosan terms denoting flocked ungulate animals, usually inhabiting steppes and semi-deserts. Finally, the Levant appears to be an attested region from where populations began to spread starting in the early Neolithic, covering not only wide tracts of southwestern Asia, but also the adjacent parts of the Mediterranean and Africa. So the Levant seems to be the homeland of the Proto-Afrosan farming lexicon, and this is connected to the Natufian and post-Natufians of the early Neolithic. So we're starting to see a nice correlation between all of this with farming, with the Afro-Asiatic languages, which of course is the ancestor of the Semitic language, and also these people known as Natufians. So this is the Proto-Afrosan lexicon confirming West Asian homeland pastoralism. And this is also from Alexander Metlorev. And it reads, the article presents one more step towards the equation of the culture of speakers of Proto-Afrosan, reconstructed on the basis of paleo-linguistic data with the early Neolithic post-Natufian culture of the Levant. According to the glottochronological method of S. A. Sarstren, Proto-Afrosan is dated back to approximately 10,000 BC, the same period as post-Natufian, supposed to be the cradle of agriculture and livestock breeding on the planet, as far as radiocarbon dating tells us. The article offers evidence for the presence of a layer of pastoral lexicon in Proto-Afrosan in the form of 26 reconstructed names for large and small cattle and various other pastoral terms. The objective of the present paper is to present further evidence in time referring to pastoralism, presumably practiced by the Proto-Afrosan speaking community, for the identification of this community with the early Levantine villagers associated with the early Neolithic post-Natufian culture. So again, it is these early Levantine villagers who are basically associated with the early Neolithic post-Natufian culture, and these would be Proto-Afro-Asiatic speakers. These villagers left some of the earliest known archaeological evidence for the cultivation of domesticated crops, cereal, and the raising of domesticated livestock. And that's the other thing as well. It is these early Levantine villagers that are the first to cultivate and domesticate crops as well as to domesticate livestock such as sheep and goats and cattle. It is for archaeologists to evaluate the correspondences between the archaeological evidence from the Levant as well as adjacent regions, and the reconstructed terminology referring to incipient agro-pastoralism in the Proto-Afro-Asiatic language date by the new version of the linguistic method of gladiochronology to approximately the same period, 12,000 through 10,500 BP, and presumably the same area. This is part of a broader project aimed at drawing a most comprehensive picture featuring practically all aspects of life of early Neolithic people in the Near East, which can be drawn from the reconstructed Proto-Afro-Asiatic lexicon, namely terms referring to people and society, economic life and technology, intellectual culture, and natural and physical environments. So here is a map detailing the Natufian culture. You have the Harifian culture right here, which is the latest stage of the Natufian culture. You have the late Natufian culture, which is highlighted in light gray, and then you have the darker gray, which is the early Natufian homeland. And again, all of this is within the Levant, stretching from Sinai all the way up into modern-day Syria. So the Harifian culture is the latest stage of the Natufian culture. Proto-Semites would descend from Harifians and pre-pottery Neolithic B Levantine populations. Harifian is a specialized regional cultural development of the Epi-Paleolithic of the Negev Desert. It corresponds to the latest stages of the Natufian culture. More recently, Jairus Zarins has suggested that the development of a circum-Arabian nomadic pastoral complex of cultures developed in the period of the 6200 BCE climactic crisis, stretching from southern Palestine down the Red Sea shoreline and northeastward into Syria and Iraq, spreading Proto-Semitic languages through the region. This complex may have developed from the fusion of Harifian and pre-pottery Neolithic B cultures in southern Palestine. So we see Proto-Semitic people, Proto-Semites, are connected to the Harifian and the pre-pottery Neolithic B cultures in the Levant. And this is important to know because Harifians and pre-pottery Neolithic B, they descend from Natufians. By the way, this is from the book Early Pastoral Nomadicism and the Settlement of Lower Mesopotamia. Harifian has close connections with the late Mesolithic cultures of Phylum and the eastern deserts of Egypt, whose tool assemblages resembles that of the Harifian. Fusion with animal domestication elements of the pre-pottery Neolithic B culture is hypothesized by Jairus Zarins to have led to the Circum-Arabian nomadic pastoral complex, a group of cultures that invented nomadic pastoralism. It may have been the original culture which spread Proto-Semitic languages throughout the region. Again, pre-pottery, Neolithic B, and Harifian, basically, that is where Proto-Semites would come from. And the pre-pottery Neolithic B and the Harifians descend from the Natufians. Again, this is from the early pastoral nomadicism and the settlement of Lower Mesopotamia. So here is the map detailing where all of this is taking place. The Harifians, as I said before, are in Sinai, and here is the map of the late Natufian / early pre-pottery Neolithic A culture, because they descend from pre-pottery Neolithic, and Harifians descend from the Natufians, and you can see all the various sites down here where these cultures are taking place. All these sites are in the Harifian and Natufian area of the southern Levant. Proto-Semites would descend from Harifians / pre-pottery Neolithic B populations. The PPNB was in the Levant, and they practiced early pastoralism and agriculture. And this is the book Early Pastoral Nomadicism and the Settlement of Lower Mesopotamia, and it reads the pre-pottery Neolithic B complex and the Fertile Crescent. The PPNB cultural manifestations appear to solidify and expand on the earlier tenuous steps toward mixed agriculture that perhaps were begun in the late Epipaleolithic and PPNA. Since its definition at Jericho by Kenyon, the sedentary aspect of the PPNB has been found in a large arc covering Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, Syria, and Turkey. So basically, we see the PPNB culture being taken place in the Levant, basically. Recognizing the pattern, most archaeologists refer to a Levantine origin for this phenomenon. So it says it right there. It's literally a Levantine origin for the pre-pottery Neolithic B complex. So Moore suggests a concept called the ancient Levant, which included substantially all of Syria, western Iraq, most of Jordan, and a portion of northern Saudi Arabia. The researchers at Palimre refer to PPNB sites there as part of the inland Levant. So PPNB sites are basically they're a Levantine origin. It's a Levantine phenomenon, and this is where we start to see the earliest pastoralism, the earliest agriculture. It's all happening within the Levant with the PPNB, who are descendants of the Natufians. So we are dealing with a very strict and narrow timeline and location. Here is the area of which the sites are located, and here is the area of the Levant. This little U-shaped is the area that we are dealing with, the Levant area. This is the Fertile Crescent in relationship to the ancient Levant. This is the origin of the Natufians. This is the origin of the Harifians. This is the origin of the pre-pottery Neolithic B. And from all of this would come the earliest pastoralists, the earliest agriculturalists, the earliest people to form the Proto-Afro-San or Proto-Afro-Asiatic languages, as well as the Semitic language. And this is also where we see high amounts of haplogroup E. In sum, by 6200 BC, a recognizable PPNC culture has begun to penetrate the more marginal environments of the Near East, both south into the Negev and Sinai, and east of the Levant into Jordan and Saudi Arabia. In each succeeding period, the growing reliance on domesticated herds at the expense of farming and hunting and gathering can be documented, thus demonstrating the gradual but inexorable shift to specialized pastoralism. So again, like I said, we're dealing with the Levant when it comes to this early form of domesticating herds of animals and farming and hunting and gathering and basically pastoralism. This is all happening within the Levant. PPNA, PPNB, and PPNC. And here's another good paper that deals with the origins of agriculture and deals with the origins of pastoralism in connection to Afro-Asiatic languages and where it was beginning to occur. This paper is titled The Prehistory of Language from the Perspective of the Y chromosome. And it's also going to deal with the Y chromosome in connection to all of this. So it reads, the 2005 book, First Farmers, The Origins of Agricultural Societies by Peter Bellwood, provides an excellent resource for linguists who wish to explore the worldwide correlation between the origins of agriculture and the expansion of languages. In Chapter 3 of the book, page 44 through 66, he explores the origins of agriculture in Southwest Asia, focusing on a region often identified in the literature as the Fertile Crescent. This region encompasses parts of contemporary Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. The transition to agriculture in the Fertile Crescent was facilitated by the domestication of cereals such as wheat and barley, and legumes such as chickpeas and lentils from wild sources. And that's very interesting, especially with the lentils, because we know with Isaac and Jacob, there was a situation dealing with lentils. And these are the early people to basically cultivate it. But anyways, additionally, the agricultural transition in the Fertile Crescent involved the domestication of goats and sheep. The success of agriculture in Southwest Asia partly stems from improved climatic conditions following the last ice age. Another factor that ensured the success of this transformation was the development of pottery. And again, the domestication of goats and sheep is a very important element when we get to Semitic populations. But prior to the adoption of agriculture in Southwest Asia and elsewhere in the world, for that matter, the human tribe practiced hunter and gatherer techniques in order to survive. The evolution of agriculture in Southwest Asia generally follows a series of cultural transitions that begun with the Natufians, followed by the pre-pottery Neolithic A and pre-pottery Neolithic B, and then finally the development of pottery itself. The Natufians stand as an important cultural transition because they were the last hunter-gatherers in the Middle East. So we already see right here that Natufians, followed by pre-pottery Neolithic A and pre-pottery Neolithic B, which comes from Natufians. These are the peoples that created pottery, and these are the peoples that are the last hunter-gatherers in the Middle East because they are going to become the first people to domesticate animals such as sheep and goats, as well as start farming. So it reads, the Natufians appeared near the Sea of Galilee in what is now present-day Israel. Bar Joseph, 1998, paints a picture of everyday Natufian life, which centered on the hunting of gazelle and other animals. Moreover, and more significantly, he reports that they practice intensive and extensive harvesting of wild cereals that grew abundantly in the region at the time. According to the description provided by Bellwood, 2005, this abundant supply of food allowed the Natufians to construct semi-permanent settlements, something that is unusual for hunter-gatherers. These cultures are generally nomadic. So basically, the Natufians were some of the first people to build settlements, to build homes for themselves. And like the paper said, that's unusual for hunter-gatherers because they're nomadic. They kind of just wander around. But this is why the Natufians are very and very important to us, because these are the people who are beginning to grow crops. These are the people who are making homes for themselves to live in. These are the people who are, getting animals and, raising them. That's very important when it comes to the genesis of humanity, when it comes to us starting to develop this basically urban society. So people began to domesticate the wild cereal and legumes that their Natufian ancestors had previously gathered. The pre-pottery Neolithic A culture stands as the initial Southwest Asian culture that embraced this new development. Again, that is powerful. From the descendants of the Natufians, which is the pre-pottery Neolithic A, the pre-pottery Neolithic A culture, their ancestors are the Natufians. This is where we see the basically the development of culture in Southwest Asia, like it said. So that's why Natufians are very important for us to study, because it's them that really create the basis of ancient Middle Eastern or Southwest Asian culture. And of course, they're the ones who are going to form the Afro-Asiatic languages as well. They are their descendants, thrived, and by around 10,500 years ago, large farming settlements appeared, such as the one in Abu Herrera in northern Syria. So again, we start seeing them to expand more. They go into places like northern Syria and they start creating farming settlements. That is extremely important. This development signaled the evolution of another cultural transition in the region, the pre-pottery Neolithic B culture. One of the significant innovations that occurred during this period was the development of pastoralism and herding of goats and sheep, which were once wild animals that people managed to domesticate. So now we get from the Natufians to the pre-pottery Neolithic A, then to pre-pottery Neolithic B. Now we're with the domesticating of animals, sheep and goats. Again, all of these groups descending from the Natufians. About 9,000 years ago, the development of pottery ushered in a new cultural transition in Southwest Asia. This development allowed people to cook their food more efficiently and facilitated the storage of grain after harvesting. Around this time, the climate in Southwest Asia also became more arid. According to Peter Bellew in 2005, this change in climate was accompanied by deforestation that human settlements had brought, as well as less productive soil due to over-farming. These conditions caused many people in Southwest Asia to abandon sedentary crop agriculture. Instead of cultivating crops, they turned to sheep and goat herding as a food source. By around 6,400 years ago, some of these Southwest Asian pastoralists herded their goats and sheep out of the region into Egypt. So again, when it comes to this time period and these peoples, we're dealing with 6,000 years ago. The pre-pottery Neolithic B cultures began to move around. A lot of desertification started to take place, deforestation, and people just had to leave because of the over farming, because there is a way you should farm, but again, these are the first peoples doing it. Therefore, they're not going to get everything right, but they did take their sheep and their goats with them when they went to new regions and new parts of Southwest Asia. And all of this is taking place within the Levant. Peter Bellwood, based on his interpretation of the archaeological data, suggests that Afro-Asiatic languages initially evolved in Southwest Asia and co-expanded out of this region with the spreading of agriculture. So we see that Afro-Asiatic languages, this includes Semitic, it is linked to these peoples in the Levant who spread agriculture. Interestingly, linguistic data may also support this model of Afro-Asiatic origins. Using linguistic reconstruction, Maltarev in 2002 presents a Proto-Afro-Asiatic lexicon of farming terminology. Based on the reconstructions, he suggested that the Natufians, agriculture, and Afro-Asiatic co-evolved in Southwest Asia. So basically, we see that the Natufians, agriculture, Afro-Asiatics, it all came in at once. It all co-evolved in the Levant. Finally, another reason for identifying Southwest Asia, putative homeland of Afro-Asiatic languages, is the Y chromosome data as presented below in section 4 and 5, and that will be haplogroup E, because we know the Natufians pretty much only had Y chromosome haplogroup E, as well as Proto-Afro-Asiatic speakers. But here's the area of Natufian culture. And here's the distribution of pre-pottery Neolithic B sites. Basically, they overlap each other. Basically, because PP&B and PP&A and PP&C descend from Natufians. Those are the ancestors of the Natufians. The Neolithic Levant was dominated by haplogroup E. I want to make that clear. This is from the Genomic Insights into the Origin of Farming in the Near East, and it reads, a result that finds some support from Y chromosome analysis, which shows that the Natufians and successor Levantine Neolithic populations carried haplogroup E. And successor Levantine Neolithic populations would be your PPNA, PPNB, and PPNC populations. This finding contrasts with both earlier Neolithic and Epipaleolithic Levantine populations, which were dominated by haplogroup E. The Levant was dominated by haplogroup E in the Neolithic and Epipaleolithic. And this is from Ancient DNA from Chalcolithic Israel, reveals the role of population mixture in cultural transformation. So again, here's the area of the Levant, where we see a lot of E markers from the Neolithic to the Epipaleolithic to the Copper Age and to the Bronze Age. And then here's the area of Natufian culture, and of course it overlaps because the Natufians had haplogroup E, as well as their descendants, because this is how haplogroups work. It is passed down from father to son. It is a paternal lineage. So early Proto-Semitic populations descend from Natufian, Horifian, and PPNB, or pre-pottery Neolithic Levantine populations. That is where the first agriculturalists and pastoralists spawned from. Early Proto-Semitic populations also practiced pastoralism and agriculture as well. This is from the book Early Pastoral Nomadicism and the Settlement of Lower Mesopotamia, and it reads, Prehistoric Akkad. The sudden appearance of populations without any previous occupational history in the desert and steppe raises the question of ethnic and linguistic identity. The Semitic populations, identified as Akkadians, were pastoral groups who migrated from the western desert, or Hamadad, sometime within a proto-historic Mesopotamian context. So the Proto-Semitic populations, they were pastoral groups, and if there are pastoral groups, their ancestors will likely be PPNA, PPNB, and PPNC populations, who they also would descend from Natufians. The prehistoric occupation pattern, like that of historical time, suggests a strong pastoral Semitic presence interacting with the settled populations. So again, Semites, they represent a strong pastoral presence. The early Semitic populations were definitely pastoralists. The idea that Amorites, Arameans, and Arabs were essentially pastoral nomadic Semitic people who invaded the plain has been largely accepted, perhaps based on the historical data extant for those populations. The crux of the matter in historical terms centers on the Akkadians. So again, all these ancient Semitic peoples, Akkadians, Arameans, Arabs, they're all pastoral nomadic Semitic people. And again, so I just wanted to re-illustrate that when it comes to Semites, they would descend from those pre-pottery Neolithic Levantine populations, and those pre-pottery Neolithic Levantine populations would descend from the Natufians. So it all goes down a straight paternal line from the Natufians to the PPN to the Semites, to the early Proto-Semitic population. So these cultural themes of pastoralism and agriculture is seen among Semitic people, even in the Bible, such as the patriarchs. So first, let's get into some of the simple themes when it comes to Semites, their characteristics, basically. So we're back with this book and the origins of pastoralism, and it reads, anthropologists have long debated the definition of pastoral nomadicism. Several recent syntheses have suggested that all pastoral nomads share certain characteristics such as strong, localized kinship and lineage bonds, impermanent dwellings, movement to procure pasturage and water for herds, and specific relationships to formal states. Now, all of this should be very familiar to you if you've read the scriptures. So what are some of the characteristics? Let's recover some of the characteristics of pastoral nomadicism. Strong localized kinship. This reminds me specifically when it comes to Abraham and his family, because there is a strong localized kinship between him and the people he had with them, as well as what is another characteristic, lineage bonds. And that reminds me as well as Abraham and Lot and the situation that they had with each other, permanent dwellings and movement, all of this, as well as having water for herds of animals and formal states. All of this reminds me of the very early chapters of Genesis when we're dealing with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All of this fits perfectly with that narrative, and they actually would technically be a pastoral nomadic people. So let's continue what it says. It says, thus, pastoral nomadicism seems to stress animal husbandry along patterned migration routes, exploiting marginal environments. And that is extremely true when it came to the situation between Abraham and Lot and their little skirmish when it came to the men fighting each other over the marginal region of land that they had. Thus, they had to, separate themselves. But let's finish it. It says, developmental models studying pastoral nomadicism have largely focused on the historical record, largely because researchers have conducted what a close symbiotic relationship exists between the urban settled peoples and the nomadic peoples. So again, these are the characteristics of pastoral nomadicism, and all these themes are echoed within the early chapters of Genesis with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I find that to be very interesting. So this book, titled Israel by Daniel I. Block, it actually details that even further. This is page 9, and it reads, as a whole, the Genesis picture of ancestral pastoralism is remarkably plausible in light of the Mari evidence. So, this is a perfect source dealing with Genesis and ancestral pastoralism. And again, there's always been a link when it came to Semites and pastoralism. And since it's talking about ancestral pastoralism, well, we know where that comes from. Pre-pottery Neolithic Levantine populations and Natufians. And this is from Animals and Human Society, and it reads, pastoralism featured in the Old Testament of the Bible with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob being nomadic pastoralists. And I would agree. And this source right here will go deeper into that. This is from The Pastoral Lifestyle of Abraham and His Family. And of course, you can find this in Genesis chapter 12, verse 4 through 7. But let's read what the paper says. So it says, archaeological studies of this period and region suggest the families of these narratives practice a mix of semi-nomadic pastoralism and herdsman husbandry. And we know where that comes from. And by the way, you can find this in the early books of Genesis. Because a family could not be entirely supported through shepherd herding, it is necessary to practice local agriculture and trade with those living in more settled communities. And that would make sense. Again, local agriculture, another important aspect that the Natufians developed as well. Pastoral nomadicism cared for sheep and goats to obtain milk and meat, again in the early chapters of Genesis, wool and other goods made from animal products such as leather. Donkeys carried loads, again Genesis, and camels were especially suited for long range travel, all in Genesis. The patriarchal narratives repeatedly mention the great wealth of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, early chapters of Genesis. Shepherd herding and animal husbandry were honorable fields of work and could be lucrative. And Abraham's family became very wealthy. So we see when it comes to the patriarchs within the early books of Genesis, early chapters of Genesis, and when it comes to Semitic populations in general, they practiced shepherd herding, animal husbandry, local agriculture, and this all stems from the pre-pottery Neolithic Levantines, who get it from the Natufians, and of course Semites descend from all these populations, these Natufian pre-pottery Neolithic Levantine populations. And we see even in the book of Genesis, the patriarchs practicing this same type of living that has been practiced for thousands of years prior to the patriarchs, coming from Proto-Semitic populations that go back 4000 BC in the Levant. Early Proto-Semitic populations descend from Natufian, Harithian, and pre-pottery Neolithic Levantine populations. Early Proto-Semites ultimately have a Levantine origin, and they dispersed from the Levant into Mesopotamia and Arabia. Figure 1, map of Semitic languages and inferred dispersals. The location of all languages sampled in this study, both extinct and extant, are depicted on the map. The map also represents the dispersal of Semitic languages inferred from our study and origin of Afro-Asiatic along the African coast of the Red Sea, supported by comparative analysis, is indicated in red, although other African origins of Afro-Asiatic have been proposed, such as southwest Ethiopia. The assumed location of the divergence of ancestral Semitic from Afro-Asiatic between the African coast of the Red Sea and the Near East is identified in italics. Semitic dispersals are depicted by arrows colored according to the estimated time of divergence. See colored timescale at the top figure, and it's talking about this right here. And important nodes from the phylogeny are placed on the arrows to indicate where and when these divergences occurred. So let's look at the dispersal of Semitic languages. So it has the origin of Semitic in the Levant, as I've been reiterating over and over again. The origin of Semitic is within the Levant, and it expands into Mesopotamia. It goes into Mesopotamia, and it goes into Arabia as well. So you see that this green dot, this is 6,000 years before present. 6,000 years before present is when Semites, Proto-Semites, were in the Levant, and then they expand into Mesopotamia, and they expand all the way into the Arabian Peninsula. Even in the Arabian Peninsula, they were there in 4,500 years before present. So they have an ancient presence there as well. And they go all the way throughout Arabia, even into the Horn of Africa. So this will get into the date of the origins of Proto-Semites, the Semitic language divergence dates, and it reads, in addition to delineating the relationship between different Semitic languages, our phylogenetic analysis provides dates for the divergences of the investigated languages. The main estimates of all language divergence times with associated 95% HPDs are depicted in years on the phylogeny in Figure 2. This is Figure 2, by the way. Our phylogeny indicates the most basal divergence within Semitic occurred at 5,750 years before present, suggesting an origin of Semitic during the early Bronze Age. This result implies that a hypothetical ancestral language was extant during this period and gave rise to all of the Semitic languages investigated in this study. What's interesting about this is that basically it's saying that there could have been even really a pre-Proto-Semitic language even before 4000 BC, which would be here in 5000 BC, which is 7,000 years before present. That's why it has the arrow going this way. But it's a very interesting hypothesis, because basically this means that Semitic languages really kind of split from this one centralized ancient Semitic ancestor, and that in a sense could be Shem. But let's continue what this paper is saying. The deepest four branches of the phylogeny indicate the divergence of East root being East Semitic, and Akkadian is one of the oldest Semitic languages. Here's the East Semitic right here in purple. It has Akkadian. So it says, the East root, West node A, South node E, and Central node B Semitic. These divergences are nearly coincident with largely overlapping HPDs 3,300 through 7,400 years before present, suggesting that Semitic underwent a period of rapid diversification upon its origin. And so here is the chart. It's a really great chart. 6,000 years before present is when we have Proto-Semitic, 4,000 BCE in the Levant, and there's a hypothetical language in which all Semitic languages kind of stem from, which would be in 5,000 BCE, 7,000 years before present, and that would be like a pre-Proto-Semitic language. Very, very interesting, something to look into. So let's finish. This is, by the way, from the Bayesian phylogenetic analysis of Semitic languages identifies an early Bronze Age origin of Semitic in the Near East. This is what we're reading. Our analysis of the Semitic language family produced a date phylogeny that estimates the origin of Semitic at approximately 4,400 through 7,400 years before present. The phylogeny suggests East Semitic, represented by Akkadian in this study, corresponds to the deepest branch, again, Akkadian being one of the oldest Semitic languages and East Semitic being one of the oldest. And our log F BF tests indicate that Semitic is the apparent root for the Semitic languages analyzed here. These results indicate that the ancestor of all Semitic languages in our dataset was being spoken in the Near East no earlier than approximately 7,400 years before present, after having diverged from Afro-Asiatic in Africa. Our Semitic language phylogeny indicates that the initial divergence of ancestral Semitic into East and West Semitic was nearly coincident with the divergence of West Semitic into Central and South Semitic around 5,300 years before present. The short interval between these two divergences and their overlapping HPDs suggests that both divergences may have occurred in the northeast Levant. The distribution of ancient and modern Central, and South Semitic languages is consistent with Central Semitic spreading westward throughout the Levant and South Semitic spreading southward from the Levant, eventually reaching southern Arabia. So what's interesting about this, the dispersal of early Semitic languages, is that it's dispersing basically from the Levant. It's going south, north, east. It's going all directions from the Levant. The Central Semitic branch is characterized first by a divergence into Arabic and the Levantine languages, Aramaic, Hebrew, and Ugaritic at least 3,650 years before present, and possibly shortly after East and West Semitic diverged. The Levantine languages subsequently diverged into separate lineages by approximately 4,050 years before present, but possibly as early as approximately 4,400 years before present. The expansion of the Levantine languages of Central Semitic approximately 3,650 through 4,400 years before present was probably part of the migration process that was definitive of the transition from the early to the Middle Bronze Age in the Levant. So again, these dates are very ancient, with Semitic languages originating in the Levant, going back as far as 4,000 years before present, 4,000 years ago. Within South Semitic, the early emergence of a South Arabian lineage between approximately 3,300 and 6,250 years before present may reflect an early Bronze Age expansion of Semitic from the Levant southward to the Arabian Desert. Again, Semitic origin of Semitic languages and Semites migrating from the Levant into places like Arabia. The recurrent spread of early Semitic people and their languages into the steppe and desert lands of the Arabian Peninsula, combined with biblical testimony on early Hebrew subsistence, lead us to propose that the earliest West Semitic society may have had a largely pastoralist economy, particularly adopted to such conditions. And again, pastoralism, a very important element when it comes to early Semites, early West Semites. So, conclusion. We used Bayesian phylogenetic methods to elucidate the relationships and divergence dates of Semitic languages, which we then related to epigraphic and archaeological records to produce a comprehensive hypothesis of Semitic origins and dispersals after the divergence of ancestral Semitic from Afro-Asiatic in Africa. We estimate that Semitic had an early Bronze Age origin, 5,750 years before present, in the Levant, followed by an expansion of Akkadian into Mesopotamia. Proto-Semites originate in the Levant and nowhere else. In this video, we'll actually visualize the migration of Proto-Semites from the Levant in 4000 BCE. Copyright disclaimer. Under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Non-profit educational or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. So that video perfectly illustrates the migration of early Proto-Semites, and when it comes to early Proto-Semitic populations, they would have haplogroup E, and it fits with that migration of Semites from the Levant into Mesopotamia. Again, we estimate that Semitic had an early Bronze Age origin in the Levant, followed by an expansion of Akkadian into Mesopotamia. E-M34 is the main Middle Eastern variety of E1B1B and is thought to have arrived with the Proto-Semitic people in the Late Copper to Early Bronze Age. That is from EUpedia, titled Haplogroup E1B1B. The most plausible candidates for Semitic remigration to the Fertile Crescent, with TMRCAs fitting the arrival of the Akkadians and other early Semitic peoples, are certain subclades of both E-V22 and E-V12 with relatively early TMRCAs present in the Middle East could be candidates for such remigration, such as E-FGC 14382 TMRCAs 2200 BCE and E-V 3262 TMRCAs 2600 BCE. And that is from the paper How Eurasia Was Born. And according to the theory, Afro-Asiatic languages spread to Asia via E1b haplogroup, not J1 haplogroup. It is historically known that a ruling elite class of Afro-Asiatic people, Akkadians, Assyrians, etc., also invaded the north of Mesopotamia and brought their Afro-Asiatic languages to the central and northern parts of Mesopotamia during the period of the Akkadians and Babylonians. Elite dominance model of E1, B1 might be supposed for Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians. In this sense, it might be theorized that Sumerian was the main language of the ancient Mesopotamians before Afro-Asiatic E1b overwhelmed Mesopotamia, elite dominance model, and that is from haplogroup J1 is definitely not Semitic in origin, which is true. And so this migration of Semites fits with the migration of E-markers because the early Semites would have had E-markers. They would be one and the same, starting from the Levant into Mesopotamia. Oldest samples of E in the Levant, and they go outwards into Mesopotamia where they get younger and younger, fitting with the migration of Semites as well. So Natufians, Proto-Afro-Asiatics, and haplogroup E all match up perfectly as well. Given the modern distribution of Semitic languages over the area in question, which belong to the larger Afro-Asiatic family, it seems appropriate to suggest that these first farmers of the Levant and their Mesolithic predecessors, including the Natufian culture, were speaking a Proto-Afro-Asiatic language. It may be that Proto-Semitic continued to develop within the Levant and Syria area, since both Ebelite and Akkadian early Semitic languages are there attested early, the former around 2400 BC. The Proto-Afro-Asiatic group carrying the E-P2 mutation may have appeared at this point in time and subsequently gave rise to the different major population groups, including current speakers of the Afro-Asiatic languages and pastoralist populations. Such a scenario would also explain the presence of Y chromosome haplogroup E in the Natufians and Levantine farmers, a common link between the Levant and Africa. All of this fits each other perfectly and harmonizes perfectly. Since Afro-Asiatic Semitic populations descend from Natufian, Harifian, and PPN Levantine populations, let's look at the modern distribution of their ancestry in the world. The earliest farmers from the Levant, who were the culmination of the sedentary and complex hunter-gatherer cultures of the Natufians, spread mostly southward and southwestward into Africa and were apparently encroached in their own homeland by Anatolian, Iranian, and Caucasian farmers as they expanded. Though it preserves high frequencies in the southern Levant, Palestine, Israel, and Jordan, thus the genetic ancestry derived from or closely related to the Natufians from the Levant is less widespread in the Old World than the Anatolian one, but its geographic expanse is also very remarkable, particularly in Africa. So here's a map just showing you the distribution, the modern distribution of Natufian ancestry. And I would believe that Natufian ancestry would also include basically Afro-Asiatic ancestry and Semitic ancestry. Natufian ancestry is, of course, highest in the Middle East, and then it expands into the Mediterranean and into Africa. And this is just a perfect example of what I believe would be basically the descendants of Shem, the modern distribution of the Natufian ancestry. And here's another map of the Natufian ancestry. Our Levantine Neolithic ancestry, of course, is going to be highest in the Middle East, and then it expands into the Mediterranean and Africa. And basically it stops near Syria and Iraq, and it goes below these areas, which is typically Semitic areas, both in ancient times and modern. And it's seen very low in places like Anatolia, Iran, and the Caucasus. But it's mostly from Syria and Iraq on down, which of course fits with the distribution of Semitic people. We see that in Syria and Iraq, and pretty much all this purple-blue area, this is where you have the once East Semitic languages, all of this area, and it fits with this distribution of Neolithic Levantine ancestry. It's an amazing parallel when you see this Natufian ancestry fitting the Semitic people, and that's because a lot of the original Semites likely had high amounts of Natufian ancestry. Haplogroup E also corresponds perfectly with Natufian ancestry and Afro-Asiatic populations. The Natufian culture, it was an Epi-Paleolithic culture that existed from 12,500 to 9,500 BC in the Levant. Of course, the Natufians foraged for food such as hamir wheat, barley, and almonds, and hunted gazelle, deer, cattle, horses, and wild boar. The direct descendants of the Natufian culture, known as Pre-Pottery Neolithic or PPN, were among the earliest farmers on the planet. And of course, that's what we've been reading this whole time. And here's the distribution of Natufian ancestry, again, in the Middle East, in Africa, in the Mediterranean, and it overlaps perfectly with Afro-Asiatic people. Here is haplogroup E. It overlaps perfectly with haplogroup E, the Natufian ancestry, but it also overlaps perfectly with just Afro-Asiatic people in general. Again, I want to show you that. Natufian ancestry, haplogroup E, and Afro-Asiatic people, which obviously includes Semitic people. There's a perfect parallel and overlap between all of these three genomes. And of course, when it comes to modern day people who are closest to the Natufians, it is Middle Eastern people, Semitic Middle Eastern people, such as Yemenites and Bedouins and Saudis, Arabians. Those are the groups that typically have the highest Natufian DNA. And also we see these groups do have high amounts of haplogroup E as well. And other Afro-Asiatic peoples, such as the North African Amazigh or Berber tribes. So let's break this down. Here is the Yemenites and Bedouins and Saudis. They have one of the closest genetic connections to the Levantine Natufians, and they also have a very decent amount of haplogroup E. And we see 25% to 50% of haplogroup E in Yemenites. And here's a map showing you a Y-DNA heat map showing you where this haplogroup E can be found in the Middle East. And we see a very high concentration in Yemen, in Arabia as well, all the way throughout the Arabian Peninsula. And these are the people with the highest amount of Natufian ancestry. But we also see high amounts of Natufian ancestry among the Amazigh peoples and the Libyans and the Bedouins and Tunisians and northern Moroccans, etc., where we also find a high amount of haplogroup E. So Natufian ancestry, haplogroup E. We see among Moroccan Arabs, as an example, 72%, 75%, Berber peoples, 86%, and even Moroccans, 85%. So you see a very high concentration of E among these Afro-Asiatic peoples. Algerians, 65%, Tunisians, 55%. You know, E is definitely an Afro-Asiatic haplogroup. And the same thing, again, Moroccan Arabs, 70%, Berbers, 85%, Afro-Asiatic populations. You have Libyan Arabs at 50%, Libyan Jews at 26%, and we just basically see, as I keep repeating, a perfect parallel between the genetic distance of Levantine Neolithic people, Natufian people, and haplogroup E. Palestinians, Jordanians, and Samaritans, they also have a connection with this Natufian DNA, and surprisingly, or perhaps unsurprisingly, the biggest and most important Samaritan family, the Cohen family, tradition tribe of Levi, was found to belong to haplogroup E. And Samaritans just happen to be genetically close to Natufians. Perhaps this is where they get that E from. And then when it comes to Samaritans, Samaritan Levites, as it says right here, here are the references, by the way. They have 100% haplogroup E. Arabs in Egypt have up to 62% of haplogroup E. When it comes to Jordanians, who's another group that has connections to Natufians, they have 31% of haplogroup E. Arab Palestinians, they have 31% of haplogroup E. And here is just a map of the distribution of haplogroup E within the Middle East. It is pretty distributed pretty nicely in the Middle East, I would say. And here again, just dealing with Tunisian Jews and Mozabites and Algerians and Libyan Jews and Moroccans and Sahrawi, we see that Berbers, they have up to 98% of haplogroup E, an Afro-Asiatic population. Moroccans have up to 67% of haplogroup E, and Arab Moroccans and more Amazigh peoples. And again, just looking at the distribution of Natufian ancestry It fits perfectly with the distribution of haplogroup E, and it fits perfectly with the distribution of Afro-Asiatic peoples. So Natufian, Afro-Asiatic, and haplogroup E match and line up perfectly. The closest populations to Natufians today would be Middle Eastern Semitic populations, specifically Arabians, Bedouins, and Yemeni, which would be the Semitic populations that remained isolated in the deserts of Arabia. Kind of makes sense why they would have that high percentage. Arabians and Bedouins are positioned close to ancient Levantines. This is from the genomic history of the Middle East. Arabians and Bedouins are positioned close to ancient Levantines. When we substitute Levant Neolithic with Natufians as source of ancestry in the Middle East, we found that Arabians could be successfully modeled. Arabians require additional ancestry from a Natufian-related population. And so here is a chart from the study that shows a lot of Yemenis, Saudi Arabians, United Arab Emirates, various Middle Eastern populations, but particularly a lot of Arabian and Bedouin populations with haplogroup E. And of course you have your Christian Arabs in Israel, and you have your Bedouin Negev Israelis and your Iraqis and such. But a lot of these Yemeni populations as well and Saudi Arabian populations have haplogroup E, and this fits because a lot of them are genetically linked to the Natufians, who are the first Semites. This is from Projecting Ancient Ancestry in Modern-Day Arabs and Iraqis, a key role of the past exposed Arabo-Persian Gulf on human populations, and it reads, modern Saudi Arabian and Yemeni samples clustered tightly in the lower left quadrant, overlapping with the 3 Natufian samples, and were close to the Levant PPNB, PPNC, and Levant Bronze Age samples. So we see that Arabians and Yemeni people are genetically very close to Levant PPNB, PPNC, and Levant Bronze Age samples. That's very interesting. And of course, those groups are connected to the Natufians. And so here is Levant PPNB. We see it in Yemen and in Saudi Arabia. They have Levantine gene flow, which is over to 50 to 60%, as you can see right here. That's a very decent amount. And just showing you more of the charts, we see that when it comes to Natufian DNA, Yemen and Saudi Arabia, they have it at over 50 to 60%. And you also see it in Oman and Oman and the United Arab Emirates, but they typically have more Ibero-Maurutian. And over here, here's just another chart. Yemen, Saudi Arabia, we have Natufian at very decent percentages, as well as Ibero-Mauritian. And again, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, they have Natufian and Ibero-Mauritian. So Natufian and Ibero-Mauritian DNA seems to be a good representation of the early Proto-Semitic genome. 3 of the individuals had Y chromosomes belonging to haplogroup E1b1, which likely originated in East Africa and is also found in early Neolithic farmers from Jordan. Natufian genomes also show similarity to modern-day populations in Saudi Arabia, as well as the Bedouin nomadic people of the Arabian Peninsula. Again, Natufian genomes are closest when it comes to modern populations of the Bedouin nomadic peoples of Arabia. And this is from DNAconsultants.com. And this fits with what we find when it comes to ancestral E lineages. Curiously, ancestral E lineages, that star means basal, so basal lineages, ancestral basal E lineages have been detected in the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant. So we find basal forms of E in the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant. So that makes a lot of sense. And that is from the paper Carriers of Mitochondrial DNA, Microhaplogroup L3, Basal Lineages Migrated Back to Africa from Asia around 70,000 years ago. And that fits with this book. This paper makes an additional inference, since there is archaeological and physical anthropological reason to believe that the Natufians were related to modern Semitic-speaking peoples of the Levant. this would mean Semites, would have haplogroup E if they are descending from these Natufians. And again, when it comes to Semites of the Arabian Peninsula, where do they come from? Within South Semitic, the early emergence of a South Arabian lineage between approximately 3,300 and 6,250 years before present may reflect an early Bronze Age expansion of Semitic from the Levant southward to the Arabian desert. So again, it makes sense why these Arabian, Yemeni, Bedouin peoples have this high amount of Natufian ancestry. It's because South Semitic people come from the Levant. They come from the Levantine region where Natufians were, where Proto-Semitic originated from. The reoccurrent spread of early Semitic peoples and their languages into the steppe and the desert lands of the Arabian Peninsula, combined with biblical testimony on early Hebrew subsistence, led us to propose that the earliest West Semitic society may have had a largely pastoralist economy practically adopted to such conditions. But the main thing I want you to get is this, that the early Semitic peoples originated in the Levant, and they spread from the Levant into Arabian when it comes to South Semitic, and this makes sense as to why Bedouins and Arabians have this high amount of Levantine Bronze Age and Levantine PPNB and basically Natufian ancestry. Because the highest distribution of Natufian DNA is in the Levant and in Arabia, and you can see as it emanates outward into places like the Mediterranean and into Africa. And Yemenites, again, Bedouins, Arabians, they have a very decent amount of haplogroup E, ranging from 25% to 50% among the Yemenites. And here's a map just showing you that haplogroup E among modern Arabians and Bedouins. So Arabians, Bedouins, and Yemeni people with Natufian ancestry and haplogroup E probably represent the best example of a Proto-Semite because they are an isolated population. And since Arabians, Bedouins, and Yemenis were in the Arabian deserts, they managed to sort of keep that pure stock. With that being said, let's recap everything that we've covered in one swift sweep. Early Proto-Semitic populations descend from Natufian, Harifian, and PPNB Neolithic populations. Early Proto-Semites have a Levantine origin, and they dispersed from the Levant in 4000 BC into Mesopotamia and Arabia. Culturally, Neolithic Levantines were the first pastoralists and agriculturalists. Early Semitic populations practiced pastoralism and agriculture. Neolithic Levantines would have had haplogroup E, and early Proto-Semitic people would also have haplogroup E. The Natufian culture is a Epipaleolithic archaeological culture of the Levant dating to around 15,000 to 11,500 years ago. The culture was unusual in that it supported a sedentary or semi-sedentary population even before the introduction of agriculture. The Natufian communities may be the ancestors of the builders of the first Neolithic settlements of the region, which may have been the earliest in the world. According to Christy G. Turner II, there is an archaeological and physical anthropological reason for a relationship between the modern Semitic-speaking populations of the Levant and the Natufian culture. So what we see is that the area of Natufian culture and Proto-Semites, they're in the same exact region. And Natufians would be the first agriculturalists, and Semites would spawn from them. According to the genetic analysis done on 6 Natufian remains from northern Israel, the Natufians carried the Y DNA haplogroup E-Z830, a somewhat upland clade of E-M123, and therefore ancestral to it. The Natufians were one of the first settled peoples in the world and may have contributed to the domestication of certain crops and thus the advent of agriculture. The discovery of E-Z830 without other clades suggests an indigenous presence in Canaan and Israel and predates all other clades, which are not known to have existed in the region at the time, 10,000 years before present. So haplogroup E was in the Levant because it belongs to the Natufians, and we have haplogroup E from the Mesolithic all the way up into the Bronze Age, and frankly, even to the modern era of today, haplogroup E is still in the Levant. So the Harifian is a specialized regional cultural development of the Epipaleolithic of the Negev Desert. It corresponds to the latest stages of the Natufian culture. So as we can see, we're actually moving down the timeline. We went from the Natufians, now we're with the Harifians, and this will be in 800 BC through 8000 BC. And soon after the Harifians, it will be followed by the pre-pottery Neolithic A. But we're moving down the timeline. Harifian has close connections with the late Mesolithic cultures of the phylum and the eastern deserts of Egypt, whose tool assemblages resembles that of the Harifian. Fusion with animal domestication elements of the pre-pottery Neolithic B culture is hypothesized by Jairus Zarins to have led to the Circum-Arabian Nomadic pastoral complex, a group of cultures that invented nomadic pastoralism and may have been the original culture which spread Proto-Semitic languages throughout the region. Proto-Semitic comes from Harifians and pre-pottery Neolithic B cultures, which both descend from Natufians. Here's the area of the Harifian landmass, and here's the area of the late Natufian, early pre-pottery Neolithic A, and they're all one and the same. And here's all the sites where these Harifian and Natufians and PPNB are located, all in the Levant. Pre-pottery Neolithic B is part of the pre-pottery Neolithic, a Neolithic culture centered in Upper Mesopotamia and the Levant. Like the earlier PPNA people, the PPNB culture developed from the Mesolithic Natufian culture. Pre-pottery cultures come from the Natufians. Work at the site of En Gazel in Jordan has indicated a later pre-pottery Neolithic C period, which existed between 8,200 and 7,900 BP. And as we can see, we're moving further down the timeline. Jairus Zarins has proposed that a Circum-Arabian nomadic pastoral complex developed in the period from the climactic crisis of 6,200 BC, partly as a result of an increasing emphasis in PPNB cultures upon animal domesticates and a fusion with Harifian hunter-gatherers in southern Palestine and affiliated connections with the cultures of phylum and the eastern desert of Egypt. Cultures practicing this lifestyle spread down the Red Sea shoreline and moved east from Syria into southern Iraq. And that, of course, fits perfectly in the Levant, and it overlaps, of course, with the Natufians. Pre-pottery sites, Harifians, Natufians, all one and the same. En Gazel is a Neolithic archaeological site located in metropolitan Amman, Jordan. The settlements at En Gazel, Spring of the Gazelle, first appeared in the Middle Pre-Pottery Neolithic B. Y-DNA haplogroup E1B1B2 has been found in 75% of the En Gazel population, along with 60% of pre-pottery Neolithic B populations, and is present in all three stages of PPNB and in most Natufians. So basically, we find haplogroup E throughout the pre-pottery Neolithic period, and this is the period in which Semites would come from. This is why early Semites would have haplogroup E. Here is the En Gazel PPNB, nothing but haplogroup E. Here is the Natufians, haplogroup E. Here is a population in Anatolia, Turkey, haplogroup E, a sample we found there. Pekin Cave, haplogroup E. It's all throughout the Levant. from the southern Levant all the way to the northern Levant, where the origins of pastoralism and the origins of agriculture would come from. These peoples with E markers who would spawn the early Proto-Semitic population. More recently, Jairus Zarins has suggested that the development of the Circum-Arabian nomadic pastoral complex of cultures developed in the period of the 6200 BCE climactic crisis, stretching from southern Palestine down the Red Sea shoreline and northeastward into Syria and Iraq, spreading Proto-Semitic languages through the region. This complex may have developed from the fusion of Harifian and pre-pottery Neolithic B cultures in southern Palestine. And if Proto-Semites are coming from Harifian and PPNB populations, then their Y-DNA chromosome is going to be haplogroup E. Here is the area of the Natufian, pre-pottery, and Harifian homeland. And here's the area of the Proto-Semitic homeland. It overlaps perfectly because Semites descend from Natufian, Harifian, pre-pottery Neolithic cultures. What I find most fascinating about the homeland of ancestral Semites, the Natufians, and Proto-Semites, both being in the Levant, is that they overlap perfectly, especially with the promised land given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Technically, the Levant, the promised land, would be the rightful homeland of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Israelites, because it was the original home of the Natufians, the ancestors of Semites and Proto-Semites. Look at that. This is the area of Natufian culture, of course, from the Negev all the way up into modern-day Syria. And here is the land given unto Abraham, the promised land, stretching from where? The Negev all the way up into modern-day Syria. It's amazing how they both overlap each other. The homeland, the ancestors of all Semites, Natufians, is basically the same landmass as the promised land given unto Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And in a sense, this would be their rightful land since, they are Semites. And here's the area of Proto-Semites. Proto-Semites will also come from the Levant, and it is the same landmass from the Negev all the way up into modern-day Syria, and it fits perfectly with the Promised Land. So basically, the ancestors of Semites, Natufians, pre-pottery Neolithic, and Harifians, and the Proto-Semites themselves, and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it all is taking place in the Levant, and it all overlaps each other perfectly. It's almost like the Levant is the rightful land of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the Israelites. It's almost like this land was meant to be theirs because their ancestors came from there. Therefore, I conclude that Natufians, Harifians, and pre-pottery Neolithic Levantines represent ancestral Semitic populations, and that early Proto-Semitic people emerged from these populations in 4000 BC in the Levant and began to spread from the Levant into Mesopotamia and Arabia. By the way, Abraham's ancestors will be part of that migration. Genetically, early Proto-Semitic populations would have Natufian ancestry and carry haplogroup E as their paternal marker. As an example, the purest Semitic types would be Arabians, Bedouins, and Yemenis with this genome. So here, the ancestors of Semites, the Natufians, Proto-Semites themselves, and the Levant. Then, of course, we have the Promised Land. And then we have the distribution of Natufian ancestry, which would be basically Afro-Asiatic ancestry, which, of course, matches with Afro-Asiatic people. And Afro-Asiatic people and Natufian ancestry overlap with the distribution of haplogroup E. So it all makes sense. I would also say that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would similarly have the same type of genetic Natufian ancestry and carry the Y chromosome haplogroup E in their paternal lineage since they are early Semites. But this is where I end the Natufian Afro-Asiatic Proto-Semitic genome. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. Don't forget to subscribe and share the video. Click the bell. Leave a comment for any questions you might have and follow my social media platforms that you are about to see. And with all of that out of the way, have a great day and shalom.